we're going to start thinking about the chordates, which include the vertebrates. Now, before we get to the chordates, I do want to come back to something that I talked about the other day. I said that I'd show you a picture of a Goliath beetle. So here's a picture of a Goliath beetle on somebody's hand to give you an idea of the scale. There are different types of Goliath beetles, but as you can see, these are pretty big insects. You wouldn't want to run into something like this in your basement. Now let's think about chordates. When we look at chordates, the typical chordate is considered to have a body kind of like a tadpole. And there are 4 distinct characteristics that we can observe in this body. They have a flexible support rod, and it goes longitudinally, which just means lengthwise, along the dorsal backside. And this flexible support rod, which is shown in kind of yellowish here or goldish, is the notochord. Now, people have a notochord, but we only have a notochord for a very brief period of time in the embryo, and then it's gradually replaced by our vertebrae. Right above the vertebrae, remember, most animals are walking on 4 legs or crawling on their stomach. So if you were thinking about a person, it would be behind the notochord. There's a dorsal hollow nerve cord. So this is our spinal cord. It's not called a spinal cord in all the organisms in the chordates, but it is in some. So when we look at this, notice that it says hollow. If you've had an anatomy and physiology class, you might remember that in the middle of the spinal cord in people, there's something called the central canal. And the central canal extends into the brain. It forms the 4 ventricles. And so this hollow part is the central canal and these ventricles in the brain. Notice that this dorsal nerve cord gets a little bit thicker up towards the front end, which is where the head is. And this front end is going to form the brain. Although we say that the nerve cord is hollow, keep in mind when we say hollow, we usually mean there aren't any cells in there. There is fluid in there. So in a person, there's something called cerebrospinal fluid, which is one of the things that we look at if we think you have an infection called meningitis. Now, all chordates also have pharyngeal pouches. And these pouches are little flaps of tissue. In fish, they develop into the gills. In some organisms, in people, the pharyngeal pouches, if you would look at some of the early stages of the embryo, you start to see indentations. Remember, the pharynx is part of the digestive system. We've seen that in a couple of organisms. And if you would look at a human embryo, you would see little folds start to develop in the neck region, kind of where the gills would be on a fish, but then those folds gradually disappear. So we have pharyngeal pouches, but typically for only a brief period of time during the embryonic development. And another characteristic of the chordates is they have a muscular postanal tail. So if we look at the digestive system, here's the mouth over on the far left side, about 3/4 of the way down, here's the anus. A postanal tail extends back behind the anus. Now this might not seem like very much, but if you think about the various roundworms that we talked about, or the segmented worms, or other types of organisms, after the anus, the body generally stops. So in most chordates, this postanal tail, the key is that it's muscular. And that means that this postanal tail, think about how a fish swims, if you've ever seen them flipping their tail fin back and forth. This postanal tail is going to usually help the chordate to swim. Now, along this postanal tail are some muscle blocks. They're sometimes called somites. And some people consider that these muscle blocks are actually a fifth characteristic of chordates. Some people just kind of include them with the postanal tail. So I haven't listed them separately, but if you were looking them up on Wikipedia or something, you might see that listed as a fifth characteristic. So if we look at the phylum Chordata, it's divided into several subphylum. So one of the subphyla is the Cephalochordata, which really only includes one type of organisms, some things called lancelets, or the genus name is Amphioxus, or sometimes it's Branchiostoma. Branchiostoma is kind of the older name, but that's still around. And these organisms resemble kind of long, skinny tadpoles. The adults can move around, but they generally don't. They're another type of filter feeder. Remember, we talked about some of the Protista that were filter feeder. We also talked about some organisms like clams and sponges and coral that were filter feeders. So this is another example of a filter feeder. And what they do is they use their muscular tail and they burrow down into the sand in the water. And then they stick their mouth out, and their mouth is surrounded by tentacles. And they wave these tentacles. They don't catch food in their tentacles, but they wave these tentacles and they create a current that flows through their body. And then they trap food particles in these pharyngeal pouches. So here's a photograph. You might be able to just barely make out some of the tentacles around the mouth, but here are 3 adults that are buried in the sand. And these organisms can actually get to be about 2 or 3 inches long. So they're decent sized. Another subphylum of the vertebrates is the Tunicata. And again, if you're looking them up in another reference, they might be listed as Urochordata because this was their name until a few years ago. And this includes some organisms called tunicates or sea squirts. And they're actually named because they have an outer covering, a tunic. And this tunic is made of proteins and carbohydrates. And it's basically a protective structure. Even though they don't look as similar to the vertebrates as the cephalochordates do, as I say, the cephalochordates kind of look like a tadpole. The tunicates are actually more closely related. Their larvae look like tadpoles, but once they become an adult, they settle down and they pump water through their body. They have an in-current siphon and an ex-current siphon, and the water kind of squirts out of their ex-current siphon, which is why they're sometimes called sea squirts. And again, they can actually get pretty good sized. They often live in colonial arrangements where you'll see a big clump of them on the sea floor. And most of the things that we look at that are brightly colored when we look at photos, I'm always telling you that they're not really this color. They've been stained so that they show up better. Sea squirts show up real well. Sea squirts are pretty much every color of the rainbow. If you do a search with Google or Bing or whoever you use, and you look for sea squirts or tunicates, and you look at the pictures, they are all sorts of wild colors. Now, one of the reasons that this might help them in nature is, keep in mind with animals, we talked about this a little bit back when we discussed evolution, animals that are brightly colored are often poisonous. and the bright colors are warnings. Tunicates aren't generally poisonous, but remember, we talked about some organisms that use bright colors as a form of mimicry to scare organisms away that might eat them. So let's look at a cladogram of chordates. And notice that this cladogram only includes the vertebrates. So if we had the hemichordata on here, I'm sorry, if we had the cephalochordata and the tunicata on here, the tunicata would be a group that split off to the side before the first group that's shown. And the cephalochordata would split off even before then. So this shows us some of our main groups of organisms. Now, one of the things that we want to keep in mind when we think about the chordates, if we look at animals, there are about 34 different phyla of animals. And about 8 or 9 of those are worms. So there's a lot of different ways to be an animal and be a worm. If we look at the chordata, half the different groups we have within the chordata, within the vertebrata, are different types of fish. So there's a lot of different ways to be a fish and be a vertebrate. So the first group of fish that split off from the other group of vertebrates is the jawless fish. And we'll talk about this. They're sometimes classified in one class, sometimes in 2 classes. The remaining fish started to develop some hard, bony plates, especially in their head. And this group split to form 2 different lineages. One is fish that have a skeleton made of cartilage. And probably the best example of that, something that you're all familiar with, is the sharks. You may not realize it because they look very different, but a group that's closely related to the sharks is the rays. So their body form is very different, but they have a very similar embryonic development. They both have skeletons made of cartilage. So we have pretty good evidence that they're closely related. The remaining fish kept a skeleton with these hard plates, and the hard plates eventually developed into the cranium, the bones that surround the brain in the skull. And this group split off into a couple of different groups. One of the main groups is what this chart calls the modern bony fish. So sharks have a skeleton of cartilage, bony fish have a skeleton of bone. Now, one group of fish with bony skeletons moved on to land. And when they moved on to land, they formed amphibians. Amphibians literally means things that live both lives. And the 2 lives that amphibians live is they live on the water and they live on the land. So the first amphibians, the primitive amphibians, are extinct now, but they do have many surviving relatives: frogs, toads, salamanders. The other group split off and ended up forming organisms that were called primitive reptiles. And again, the primitive reptiles eventually became extinct. Now notice when we're talking about primitive amphibians and primitive reptiles becoming extinct, the species that we put in those groups are extinct, but they did leave some descendants. And when we look at the family tree here, the first group that branched off was the mammals. So some people think because we're mammals that surely mammals were the most recent thing to evolve, but that's not true. The other group became modern reptiles. And relatively recently, the birds branched off from one group of modern reptiles, the group that includes T-Rex and velociraptors and things like that. So there are a lot of people that consider birds to be just one subdivision of the reptiles. We'll talk about them as a separate group, but not everybody agrees with that assessment. And in fact, right now, it's not quite like Jurassic Park, but we do have 2 labs that are trying to produce dinosaurs by genetic engineering. Now, they're not trying to do it the way that the movie Jurassic Park, or if you read the book, the way that they try to do it there. In Jurassic Park, the way they try to make dinosaurs is they go back and they find preserved blood-sucking insects. And they find blood-sucking insects that have dinosaur blood in them. And then they extract the dinosaur DNA from the blood, and they use the dinosaur DNA to genetically engineer their dinosaurs. Now, remember what I've said on several occasions. The way evolution works is we take developmental patterns that are still there and we build on them. So the 2 labs that are trying to genetically engineer dinosaurs are doing it by a process that in most human activities we refer to as reverse engineering. The genes that made birds' ancestors, dinosaurs, are still there in the bird DNA. So what these labs are trying to do is reactivate the genes. If we look at birds, for instance, birds don't have any teeth. Reptiles have teeth. So they're trying to turn the genes for making teeth back on. And they're trying to gradually create a dinosaur. At this point, they really haven't had much luck, so we don't have to worry too much about T-Rex running wild through the streets of Chicago or anything like that. But they're basically trying to reactivate genes that have been turned off or deactivated in birds. So we're going to look at all these various classes. So let's look first at the jawless fish. And the jawless fish are the class Agnatha. A at the beginning of a word means not or without. Things that are asymmetrical don't have any symmetry. Gnatha refers to the jaw. So the jawless fish include 2 big groups. They're sometimes put in the same class. That's what we're doing here. They're sometimes separated. And these are the hagfishes and the lampreys. And the hagfishes kind of look like regular fishes, except for their mouth. The lampreys are sometimes called lamprey eels, but they're not really eels. There are certain types of fish that are eels. If we look at lampreys, this is the main group that has a larval stage that resembles the cephalochordates as well as the tunicates. Now, lampreys don't have some things that we associate with most of the chordates, and especially with the vertebrate side of the family. Lampreys and other jawless fish lack paired appendages. In fish, the paired appendages are the pectoral fins and the pelvic fins. In animals like ourselves, the paired appendages are the arms and the legs. So they don't have this. Here's a picture of a lamprey. And lamprey can get several feet long. Just barely visible along here, you can see some slits. Lampreys are fish, so this is their gill slits. And this is their mouth. They don't have a jaw, so their mouth is just a hole, and it has teeth arranged around that hole. And what lamprey do is lamprey attach to a fish, and when they attach to a fish, they kind of use these round teeth in their mouth, kind of like a drill. And they drill into the side of a fish and they suck the fluids out. There are lamprey in Lake Michigan that thanks to human intervention. They were in the Atlantic Ocean, but we put them in Lake Michigan by mistake. But if we look at fish in Lake Michigan, people who do some fishing sometimes catch some of the big fish in Lake Michigan, like a lake trout, and they'll find a lake trout that has a big circular scar on its side. That's a lake trout that was lucky enough to escape from a lamprey. Not all lake trout are so fortunate. We look at lamprey, they are important just because they kill so many fish. They were inadvertently brought into the Great Lakes back in the 1800s. And people have been trying to clear them out of the Great Lakes ever since without any success. They're still there. Once we get invasive species into an area, species that come in from a different area, it's often difficult to eliminate them because they don't have any natural predators in the area. Now let's look at the class Chondrichthyes. This chondra at the beginning means cartilage. Ichthyes just means fish. So remember what I said, this includes the sharks and the rays. And when we look at these organisms, they have a skeleton made of cartilage. But it appears that their very early ancestors, if we go back and look here, if we look at some of their ancestors down here, some fish called placoderms, it looks like some of those fish probably had some plates of bone. So they evolved from fish that had at least a small amount of bone. So they've kind of replaced that bone with cartilage. Now notice that's, in some sense, backwards to what happens in most of the other vertebrates. If we look at a human fetus and if we look at a baby, the skeleton is mostly made of cartilage, and the bone gradually replaces the cartilage. And in fact, at some point during your life, if we look at the cartilage in your legs and your arms, when it's completely replaced by bone, that's when you reach your final adult height. And there's a little place called the growth plate where that bone is growing and replacing the cartilage. And if you break that growth plate when you're a small child, you might not grow to be your full adult height. Now we think the reason that this group evolved skeletons of cartilage is because cartilage weighs less, which helps them stay afloat in the water, and it's more flexible, should say, than bone. One of the reasons that weight is important is because chondrichthyes, like sharks and rays, don't have something called a swim bladder. Now, we'll talk about a swim bladder later when we talk about osteichthyes. But for now, just think of a swim bladder as being like an inner tube. And most fish that aren't chondrichthyes have a swim bladder. And like an inner tube, this swim bladder is filled with air. So the swim bladder helps them float. And they can adjust their height in a column of water by moving air into the swim bladder or moving air out. If they pump more air into the swim bladder, they rise higher in the water. If they pump air out, they sink lower. So how do they stay afloat? Well, really two main ways besides saving weight. One way they save weight and float is because they have an immense liver. The liver can be 25% of their body weight. Now in you, the liver is large. When we do a dissection, most people are surprised at the size of the liver. It's bigger than your stomach or your intestines, some of the other organs that we might talk about more frequently. But with sharks, the key thing is this liver produces large amounts of something called squalene. And squalene is a very oily substance. If you've ever smelled sharks, they have a distinct odor, and a lot of it is this squalene. And from a chemical perspective, oils have a lower density than water. And things that have a higher density than water sink in water. Things that have a lower density float. So squalene helps the shark to float. They also have something called a heterocercal tail, or technically it's called their caudal fin. So here's a diagram of a shark. Their tail is a heterocercal tail. We know that hetero, like heterozygous, always means different. So this heterocercal tail has a larger upper lobe than lower lobe. And because of this larger upper lobe, when the shark waves its tail back and forth in the water, this helps the shark to stay afloat. And so for this reason, we sometimes say that sharks can't sleep. That doesn't quite seem to be true. When we study sharks in the water, they do sleep, but as they sleep, they still swing their tail back and forth a little bit. And if they're not vigilant about doing that, they gradually sink. Now, sharks do have some dorsal fins. The first dorsal fin is typically the one that we think of when we think of sharks coming through the water. And sharks do have some paired appendages. They have pectoral fins and pelvic fins. And these fins are both paired. There's one on the right side, there's one on the left side. Now, if we look at sharks, sharks are what's called an apex predator, or they're sometimes called a top carnivore. And basically what this means is they eat other stuff, but nothing really eats them. Although sharks will eat other sharks, they're not too picky. Now, most species of apex predators, things like sharks, eagles, lions, most of these types of species have a very low reproductive rate. Why? Well, they do produce more offspring that can survive, just like Darwin predicted. But most of the offspring that don't survive die at a pretty young age. Once they get a little bit older, sharks can expect to live a long lifetime. The problem with having a low reproductive rate is this works fine in nature where you don't have many organisms that prey on you. But since the book Jaws was published, Jaws convinced people that sharks were really terrible. And a lot of sharks have now been designated as endangered because of all the hunting that people do. Since 1970, it's estimated that shark populations around the world have declined by more than 70%. If we just look at last year, sharks killed 10 people around the world. It's estimated that sharks may have killed about 15 people, but some of the shark attacks, because of where they occur, aren't reported. Nobody knows that it was a shark attack. And there were a lot of people killed in 2020. This is more people than are killed by shark attacks most year. On the other hand, even with all the COVID restrictions, people killed more than 100 million sharks. So in this case, people are definitely winning this war. It may not be good to win it because sharks are important to the food chains in the ocean. It's not clear what will happen if we eliminate them. You know, sharks don't usually attack people. There are many species of sharks, and there are only about 15 species of sharks that have been confirmed to actually attack people. So shark attacks are relatively rare. Not only did sharks only kill 10 documented people last year, but there weren't all that many attacks, and most people who were attacked actually survived. It's not quite like the movies make it sound, you know, which isn't surprising. You've already learned that, you know, movies are more science fiction than science. Now, if we look at sharks, sharks do have several strategies to increase their survival. A lot of species of sharks are ovoviviparous. Now, some animals, like people and other mammals, are viviparous. Our young are born alive. Some animals are oviparous. They lay eggs, like birds. Some animals, like many of the sharks, are ovoviviparous. They lay eggs, but the eggs are born alive. How can this happen? Because although the female produces eggs, she retains the eggs inside her reproductive system. And after the eggs hatch, the baby sharks swim out of their mother. And there's one big advantage to this. Fish eggs are nice and soft. They're easy for other fish to eat. So if you want to protect fish eggs, one way to do this is to keep the eggs inside mama shark, because there aren't too many things that are going to attack the mother shark and be able to eat the babies, eat the eggs. Notice that the largest fish is a type of shark called a whale shark, so you can tell it's relatively large. And it can get close to 20 meters long and close to 10 metric tons. And this is another example of an organism that's a filter feeder. Whale sharks are different than other filter feeders that we've talked about. We've talked about filter feeders that sit in one spot and either let the current move water through their body or pump the water through their body and then filter small food particles out. Whale sharks basically swim with their mouth open, and they eat the microscopic organisms that are in the ocean water that come into their mouth this way. But they are considered to be filter feeding. And notice one of the things that we see very typically, the largest organisms in almost every group, that includes carnivores that eat meat and herbivores that eat plants. The largest organisms are almost always herbivores, things that eat plants. Monster movies like to make us think that it's carnivores, but not so much. Okay, let's look at one more group of fish. And this is the class Osteichthyes. And osteo means bone. So this is really most of the fish that you've heard of. Includes the fish that people typically eat. Includes fish that you've seen in, nature specials like piranhas. It includes fish like sturgeons. It includes fishes that are sold at pet stores. It includes some weird fish like seahorses. Does anybody know what food product we get from sturgeons? Because that's why I put them on this list.
Caviar?
Yes. So caviar is really fish eggs. And if you've ever had caviar, you can see what I mean about why fish eggs are nice and soft and easy to eat. Most fish produce a lot of eggs because most fish just release their eggs into the water. Some will lay them next to some seaweed or something so that they get trapped. But basically the eggs are easy pickings for animals that would like to eat them. Now, some of the early groups of Osteichthyes evolved some outpocketings off the esophagus. And what I mean by that is a little pouch that comes off the esophagus. And this is what forms that swim bladder that we were talking about that sharks don't have. And fish can pump gases into this swim bladder. And so this allows the fish to use this to adjust how high or low it is in a column of water. There are actually some fish that swim to the surface of the water that they're in, and they stick their head out of the water and they gulp air and put it in their swim bladder. Now, there are two main groups of osteichthyes. There's a group called the ray fin fish, and they have very thin fins. And they do have some bone and some cartilage and some other skeletal structure, some things that we call ligaments and things like that. And these are at the base of the fin. So they're basically where the fin comes into the body. And most of the fish in the osteichthyes are ray fin fish. However, the other group is important. And this is a group called the lobe-finned fishes. And their fins, keep in mind, we're mostly talking here about the two pectoral fins in the front and the two pelvic fins in the back. But their fins are thick. They kind of resemble, you know, the flippers that you would see on a seal or the flippers on a dolphin. And we know that the lobe-fin fish actually spend a lot of their time on the bottom of the ocean. And these fins are thick enough and strong enough that they use them to crawl around. Now, if we look at some of these fish, some of these lobe-fin fish can survive periods of drought. How can they do this? Well, they can gulp air, so they can store it in that air bladder, and then they can pump it out so that they can use the oxygen in it. And lobe-fin fish can actually crawl on their lobe fins. A lot of lobe-fin fish live in tropical areas. And during the summer when it's hot, they often tend to live in shallow ponds. And if the pond that they're living in dries up, they can actually crawl on their lobe fins. Some of them can crawl up to a mile or two. There are limits since they're fish, they can't stay on land indefinitely. But they can crawl and they can move to another land, another pond. Now these fish are ancestral to the vertebrates that we call tetrapods. Remember we said earlier that pod refers to feet, tetra means four. So this is the vertebrates that have 4 feet, 4 limbs. The amphibians, the reptiles, the mammals, and the birds. And the swim bladder and the lobe fins are 2 examples of what in evolution we call pre-adaptations. So think about the swim bladder. The reason that it evolved in fish was so that they could gulp water, and if the pond they were in was drying up, they wouldn't be able to breathe with their gills necessarily, but I'm sorry, I said they could gulp water, they could gulp air. They can gulp air and then they can extract oxygen from that air. The lobe fins help them crawl to a new pond. So the swim bladder and the lobe fins help fish to survive in their watery environment. But turns out that the swim bladder and the lobe fins are also useful in a new environment, namely land. Because when you're on land, gills tend to dry out, and when they dry out, go back to something we talked about before, their surface area decreases and they're not very efficient for getting carbon dioxide out of the body and getting oxygen into the body. So by having the swim bladder and these lobe fins, some of these osteichthyes had a way to, in a sense, be ready to move on to land. Now, keep in mind, they didn't evolve these characteristics thinking about the future. They didn't think, yeah, there's all that land up there, you know, we could move up there in a few 100,000 years. They evolved swim bladders and lobe fins to help them survive in their aquatic environment. So a pre-adaptation is useful in the environment you're in now. It also turns out to be useful later, just by luck, in a new environment. Now let's look at one of the characteristics that we see in osteichthyes, as well as other fish, that is a current physiological I'm tongue-tied, that is a current physiological process that we see in all sorts of locations. And this is something called countercurrent exchange mechanisms. In a countercurrent exchange mechanism, we have two tubes that are going to exchange materials, and they flow in different directions. That's the countercurrent part. We can also have a concurrent exchange. In concurrent exchange, two things flow in the same direction. So let's look at the exchange of gases. And I want to magnify this a little bit because our numbers are not very legible. So let's look at the difference between a concurrent exchange and a countercurrent exchange. Concurrent exchange is shown on the left in the chart here. So we have water flowing over the gills of a fish. We have blood flowing through the blood vessels in the gills. So notice that the water starts out with 100% of the oxygen that it can hold. The blood starts out at 0. Now, oxygen is going to diffuse from where it's at a high concentration, 100% in the water, to where it's at a low concentration, 0% in the blood. Now, we know that in diffusion, things move from a high concentration to a low concentration. Well, notice by the time the blood leaves the gills, the blood has 50% of the oxygen it can hold. The water has 50%. Now, notice that the blood can't go to 51% and the water to 49, because remember, diffusion only happens from a high concentration to a low concentration. So once the concentrations are equal, diffusion stops. Now, if we look at the numbers for a countercurrent flow, this time notice the water is coming in on the right side and the blood is coming in on the left side instead of them both coming in on the left side. In concurrent flow, they both flow in the same direction. In countercurrent, they flow in opposite directions. So we have 100% oxygen on the right side in the water. We have a low concentration of oxygen in the blood on the left side. Now, the key thing to notice here is that when the blood leaves the gills, it has a higher concentration of oxygen. Why? Well, let's focus on where we have 50% oxygen in the water and 40% in the blood. When we have 50% in the water in concurrent flow, diffusion stops. When we have 50% concentration of oxygen in the water with countercurrent flow, diffusion continues. 70% diffusion continues. Now, why does this happen? Because instead of the concentration of the blood increasing as the concentration in the water decreases with concurrent, the water and blood both increase in the same direction, they both decrease in the same direction. So the big advantage of a countercurrent flow is if we actually want to transfer stuff from one structure to another, countercurrent is much more efficient than concurrent. So this example is taken from the gills of fish, but if you would look in your body, if we look at the blood vessels that go out into your arms or your legs or your ears, one of the things we see is that the extremities of your body are more exposed to their environment. You know, there's a lot of surface area in my finger compared to the amount of volume. Well, remember, surface area is where we exchange materials. So this means if we look at our fingers or our toes or our ears in winter, these are areas where we lose a lot of heat. So how can we reduce the amount of heat that's lost? Well, one of the ways that we do this is the artery that carries blood out into my finger is right next to the vein that carries blood back from the finger. So when the artery is going out into the finger, the artery is right next to the vein, and most of the heat from the blood in the artery goes into the blood in the vein that's coming back into the body. So that means it isn't lost. If we look in your kidneys, this same type of countercurrent flow allows animals to make urine that's very concentrated. So they don't lose a lot of water in their urine, they don't get dehydrated, but they can eliminate a lot of waste products in their urine. So in some animals, the waste products that they make are actually things like ammonia. So countercurrent flow mechanisms allow us to make very concentrated urine. They allow us to retain heat in our body. They're important in other cases too. So we're looking at an example of countercurrent flow here from fish, from their gills, but that's not the only place this happens. When we look at our diagrams, notice one thing that I don't like about this is they show the numbers for countercurrent flow on the right side. They show the diagram on the left side. They show the numbers for concurrent flow on the left side. They show the diagram on the right side. So if you look at this diagram later, keep that in mind. They kind of have those, well, seems like they're reversed to me. I don't know, maybe they had a good reason for doing it that way. So this is much more efficient. Are there any questions about fish? If there are no questions about fish for now, we're going to stop and I will talk to you tomorrow.
I have a fish question.
Sure.
So where would the coelacanth be?
The coelacanth, actually that picture I had of the lobefin fish is a coelacanth.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and they are in the group that ultimately evolved into things like us.
I see the resemblance. All right, have a good day.
You too, Nick.
I see you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.